Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar entitled Cannabis in the Era of Commercialization. My name is Christine McKenna, and I am the director of the Rockingham County Drug Treatment Court, as well as a board member for NEARCP, which is bringing this today in conjunction with ATTC, which is a part of the training materials here were supported by the grant from the Centers for SAMHSA. So we have a lot of great content that we're going to bring to you today. But a little bit about NEARCP right at the moment. This is a regional association of drug courts in the New England states, and we exist to address critical issues and emerging issues surrounding our drug courts, and looking at timely issues and ways that we can examine some critical things that might impact the way our courts are running, as well as providing new research, et cetera, that would inform courts and how they put together their practicals. So NEARCP is a tremendous organization, as I said, and we put forth various webinars, and I'll talk some more about that in a little bit. But more importantly, because you're here today to listen to our presenter, we have Scott Gagnon. He is a phenomenal presenter today, knows a lot about this topic, so I do think you're in for an incredible treat. He's a certified prevention specialist, the Associate Executive Director of AdCare Educational Institute of Maine, and the Director of SAMHSA's New England Prevention Technical Transfer Center, PTTC. He is a national speaker on a variety of prevention topics, including cannabis policy and prevention, opioid prevention, and prevention workforce development. He currently serves as the co-chair of the National Technology Transfer Center Coordination Work Group, and previously served as the chair of the National PTTC Network Cannabis Prevention Work Group. He serves as a board member of the Maine Recovery Coach Certification Board and as a member representing a public health on Maine's Marijuana Advisory Commission. He has also previously served as co-chair of the Prevention Task Force on the Maine Opiate and Collaborative, and has also previously served on SAMHSA's Center for Substance Abuse Prevention National Advisory Council. And he has been recognized for multiple awards through his organization, through his work, through the Maine Alliance to Prevent Substance Abuse and the Maine Public Health Association. And in 2017, Scott was the recipient of the Patrick J. Kennedy Outstanding Advocate Award from Smart Approaches to Marijuana. So we have a terrific guest speaker with us today, and I'm really encouraged to hear what he has to tell us. But just a little bit of housekeeping. By now, we've all been in the Zoomiverse for a couple of years here, so we're not going to go into webinar controls. Just want to put out that we want to hear from you. This is the time that you are spending with us today, and we want to make sure that you put together any questions that you have. Please drop them into the question and answer part of your Zoom webinar. We will get to your questions in a timely manner throughout the presentation, but we'll also make some time afterwards to speak as well. For your presentation today, we will send out a link afterwards. You'll get an evaluation link that will be sent from the New England Addiction Technology Transfer Center. We will fill out that link, and then you will get access to those CEUs that I know are awfully important for very many people. With that said, and then we'll get into some more of this stuff a little bit later. I'll talk to you about some of the next things that are coming up in the near future for NEARCP with our webinar series, et cetera, and other collaborative efforts that we're in. But more importantly, I'm going to get to the meat of why we're all here today, and I'll let Scott Gagnon jump in, and he can talk about what he's presenting with us today. And again, I'm so grateful that we have you today, Scott, because you really are considered a leader in this area. And as we know, we've got a changing cultural landscape as it relates to cannabis, and it leaves a lot of us in the fog. So we look forward to what you're going to tell us today. And with that, I'll go right to Scott. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So a couple things off the top. I am the same person. I know the picture you saw of me. I had the beard going on, so I just want to let you know that I haven't been, I got this thing going on again. So it is me, just to point that out. And I did one question in the Q&A I can answer right away, is that I have sent a PDF version of my slides to Ray and the group, so I think those will be going out to you all after. I can't send you the PowerPoint because it's so humongous, it won't go through your email. So yeah, so thank you very much for having me, and glad to be with you all today. And so yeah, what we're going to talk about today is cannabis in the era of commercialization here in New England. We know that there's a lot of policy change happening in all 6 of our states in one form or another. And that has a big impact on a lot of wherever we sit in sort of the behavioral health system, whether it's the drug courts or it's folks in the treatments settings, prevention settings, where we do a lot of our training. So hopefully what you get from my talk today is just a little food for thought on where we are, where we might be going, and how some emerging science can help inform how we move forward, whatever our role is um, in services. So my little disclaimer, so I'm presenting on behalf of the Prevention Technology Transfer Center for New England, which I'll talk a little bit about in a slide. And so my presentation is funded by that, and our PTTC is funded through a cooperative agreement with SAMHSA. And sort of the disclaimer is the views and opinions represented from me today are not necessarily opinions of the federal government, SAMHSA, or the New England PTTC. If you're not familiar with our PTTC, we're very similar to the ATTC in that our role really is all about translating science into practice. And so our main focus is those folks in the field that are engaged in initiatives and strategies and work to prevent substance use across the lifespan. We're one of 10 centers across the country. So we serve the 6 New England states. We're based in EdCare Educational Institute of Maine, which is here in Augusta, Maine. As a PTTC network, we believe very strongly in language, and that language matters. And so I always strive, and all of us always strive, to use person-first language. And that, I invite you to join me in that endeavor. So what we'll cover today is essentially 3 sections to this talk. The first one, I'm going to kind of do an overview, very high level overview of cannabis in New England, kind of what the lay of the land looks like, with the asterisk that it is a fast moving, evolving landscape. So what I talk about today, particularly in states like Connecticut and Vermont, where policy is changing as we speak, or being crafted, certain pieces of this may change in a matter of months. So just want to put that asterisk there. The sort of the second section is segueing into an excerpt of some content we have in a new PTTC cannabis pharmacology course. So kind of talking about some of the kind of current state of knowledge around cannabis and some of the short-term and long-term effects, because I think, again, no matter what our role is, whether we're in prevention, treatment, or drug courts, having this sort of up-to-date science information is going to help inform us in our programs and the services that we provide. And then last, I want to segue into a discussion on some of the emerging science that gets into sort of what I'll call harm reduction when we think about cannabis. So for those folks who are using cannabis, whether they're using it for adult use purposes or medicinal purposes, what is that emerging science telling us about what some of those harms are, and how can we work with folks to reduce those harms through how they're interacting with the substance? Couple terminology pieces up front. So I use the term adult use cannabis to refer to what commonly is referred to in the public square as recreational cannabis. So I avoid using recreational cannabis, particularly in the prevention field. We tend to look at it as a potentially normalizing term. So when I say adult use, I'm meaning what most people would refer to as recreational. The other piece is I tend to use cannabis more than marijuana, but know that they're pretty interchangeable. And there may be some slides that still use the marijuana terminology. And so in terms of Q&A, I have a couple of natural pauses in my talk. So definitely, if you have any questions as we go along, put them in the Q&A box, and if I can't get to them during those sort of breaks, those pauses, we'll get to them at the end. But definitely encourage you, anything that you're curious to learn more about, put it right in the Q&A. So just a tad more about my background, so you know where I'm coming from in this area. So I am a certified prevention specialist. I've been in the field of substance use prevention for 16 or so years. I also, my education, my master's degree is in public policy. So my background in this in this content and this topic area is really for both from a policy perspective, but a prevention perspective. But there's even a third hat, which is as a private citizen here in Maine, I was engaged in some public health advocacy during the cannabis legalization campaign here in Maine, which was a citizens initiative. So politically, I've had some involvement as a private citizen in this area. So it's like policy, politics, and prevention is sort of my background in this content area. So let's dive right into talking about cannabis policy in New England. First of all, here's the map of the United States. And really even just like 3 years ago, this map would have looked quite a bit different. But as you can see here in the Northeast, even beyond New England, most of our states at this point have both some sort of medical cannabis law legalization and an adult use. The exceptions currently being New Hampshire and Rhode Island, although we know in both cases there's legislation and proposals in the legislatures looking at adult use legalization. So currently not in that column, but potentially maybe moving there depending on whether or not those bills are passed and signed. Here's kind of a timeline of how this all shaped out. One of the first states, Maine was actually one of the first states to pass a medical law. It was legalized in 1999. That was actually possession, and then later they legalized the dispensary model. But there you can see the timeline in terms of how this has evolved in all the states there. I do want to provide some acknowledgement. Public Consulting Group, who is our evaluators for the PTTC, prepared some of these slides. You'll see their logo there. So I want to give them a shout out, thank them for helping me out with this. Here are the governing bodies in each of the states in terms of who in state governments is overseeing, whether it's medical cannabis or adult use cannabis. So Connecticut is the Connecticut Department of Consumer Protection is overseeing their medical marijuana program. In Maine, the Maine Department of Administrative and Financial Services, the Office of Marijuana Policy, is overseeing both medical and adult use. In Massachusetts, they have the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission, which is overseeing adult use cannabis there. New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services, their therapeutic cannabis program lives in that part of state government. Rhode Island, it's under the Department of Health Medical Marijuana Program. And then Vermont has a cannabis control board. And so if you get into the weeds, no pun intended, of this, you'll see that no two states really looks at this or regulates this quite in the same way. There are definitely common themes across the states, but there are definitely some intricacies that are unique to each of the states as well. So this is just a little bit more in depth of sort of the flow chart of each of the states. I won't go into great depth in these, but I did want to provide these as resources for you if you want to learn more again what the structure looks like in your state. So here we can see the sort of the flow for Connecticut, for Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont. And again, I won't go, these are pretty detailed flow charts, but again, I just wanted you to have these as more of a resource. Thinking of the possession amount, so this is one place where we see some differences across the states. So again, Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, and Vermont at this point have legalized adult use. And so the possession limits are different. In Connecticut, possession limit is up to 1.5 ounces. In Maine, it's 2.5 ounces. So I think Maine actually has the largest possession limit. Massachusetts, it's up to 1 ounce of flower or 5 grams of concentrate. And then in Vermont, it's up to 1 ounce. And then in Rhode Island and New Hampshire, it's adult use possession is not legalized, but it's decriminalized. And so those limits, in New Hampshire, it's up to 3/4 of an ounce, and in Rhode Island, up to 1 ounce. So you can see that this is one place where there are some differences in the state in terms of the amount that's legally able to be possessed. So this is, and again, this is the adult use law. This may look a little bit different with the medical law. For example, in Maine, just because I'm most familiar with it, the personal possession of medical cannabis can actually be up to 8 pounds. Which is a pretty high limit when you think about it. But I think the reason for that in policy is for those folks who, because of the rural nature of our states, they can't get to the dispensaries very often. That the policy reason for that was to allow to have more in their home legally. So a little bit of data in the next few slides. So this first slide is looking at the number of medical certifications. And so one asterisk I'll put on these next few slides is that this is, again, another place where all the states are fairly different in terms of if and how they collect this data. So for example, you'll see in Massachusetts, there's no data available. And I think it's just because it's not something that's publicly available. Or if it is, if someone knows of it, please put it in the chat so we can include it and update it. So you can see in the states where it is provided, where you can see the trend from 2019 to 2021, and pretty much in most cases, you see an increase in the number of medical cannabis certifications. So, in Maine, it went from, and these are in thousands. So in Maine, it went from 65.4 thousand up to 105,000 as of 2021. Now, that's a fairly large number. Maine's population, according to the last census data, is a little over 1.3 million. So it's a significant number of certifications in our state. New Hampshire, it went from 8.3 thousand up to 11.9 as of 2021. Rhode Island from 16.2 to 19.4. In Connecticut and Vermont, we only had 2021 data available, but you can see the number of certifications there. But again, overall, and this tracks with trends I'm familiar with from colleagues in other parts of the country where, even with adult use legalization happening, you still see the upward trend in certifications for medical cannabis. And there can be a lot of different reasons for that. One could be, and probably is, the difference in things like tax structures between medical cannabis and adult use. So again, being more familiar with Maine, there's no taxes for the individual for medical cannabis versus adult use. So that could be a factor there. The other piece in Maine is we had a little bit of a delay. Legalization passed in 2016. The first stores didn't actually end up opening until 2020. So there seemed to be a bit of a rush with the certifications because the adult use dispensaries hadn't opened yet. This next slide looks at the number of registered dispensaries for medicinal cannabis. And these numbers can be a little misleading in some ways. So in Connecticut in 2021, there was 18. In Maine, there were 7. So that seems like a small number. But in Maine and in other states, we also have the medical marijuana caregivers. So there's 2 routes for getting access to medical cannabis in many of these states, which is through a dispensary, a state regulated dispensary, like a brick and mortar store, or a caregiver who's legally allowed to grow up to a certain number of plants per patient and supply directly patients. So in Maine, I don't know the number, I don't think we have it in this presentation, but there are thousands of medical cannabis caregivers in Maine. So we have a very small number of dispensaries, but there are many, many caregivers that are allowed to grow and supply patients. In Massachusetts, there's 86, New Hampshire 7, Rhode Island 8, and Vermont 5. Again, this is 2021 data. This looks at the medical retail sales. So again, tracking with the certifications, not probably too surprising that you see the retail sales for medical cannabis pretty much in every state where we have it on an upward trend. Pretty dramatic, in particular in Maine and Massachusetts. And then, of course, Maine and Massachusetts at this point are the only 2 states with adult use stores regulated and open. And so as of 2021 in Maine, there were 74 active adult use retail licenses, and in Massachusetts, 191. Now those licenses will be a combination of things. There'll be dispensaries, there'll be cultivation licenses, manufacturing, testing. So they're not all dispensaries. So it's a combination of things. So the tracking, the way legalization tends to emerge in whatever state you're looking at, there's really three main stages. There's that campaign stage, or really the stage where a proposal comes forward, whether it's in the legislature or in the case of Massachusetts and Maine, where it went to a citizens initiative. So it's really putting out the proposal for either legislators or voters to vote on. And then even when that passes, it goes into the implementation stage, where the lawmaking happens to really set forward the regulation, whether it's adult use or medical, and then the rulemaking process. And then that stage three is basically everything after. Once you have the law implemented and the rules implemented, it's that legislation that comes every session that looks at continuing to kind of tinker with the law, making changes to it. So, again, where our 6 states are, New Hampshire and Rhode Island really are kind of still in that stage one, where they have bills in their legislatures looking at potentially legalizing adult use. Vermont and Connecticut are really in that implementation stage. So both have passed legislation to implement it, but now it's really in that rulemaking phase to set the fine details of what regulation will look like in those states. And then, of course, Maine and Massachusetts legalized, the rules have been implemented and stores are open. So they're in that place where there's legislation that comes forward every session to look at making continuous changes. Again, for reference, I include slides here that have links. If you really want to get into the weeds of all this stuff, of links to the statute for adult use cannabis, and then the rules and regulations. So these are the 2 links for Maine, for Massachusetts, Vermont. Of course, Vermont is still in the rulemaking phase. So on this slide, I have the statute at this point, not the rules. And same with Connecticut. The statute is passed, but the rules are not out yet. So again, these are for reference purposes if you want to learn more about the nitty-gritty details of all these laws. Couple of so I do a lot of these cannabis policy talks for our prevention field, and one of the reasons I do that for the prevention field is to have not that they're going to get engaged in policy making, but to have that literacy, to have that understanding of what these policies look like, how they progress, how to be able to track them, and how they inform sort of the work they do. And one of the things I like to do is throw out a couple of pro tips. So like kind of when you're looking at policy, and one of those is the issue of loopholes. And so anyone who's really into policy knows that when there's a law that's written and passed by a legislature, there's these gray areas that can emerge in law where there's certain aspects of whatever it is that they're trying to regulate that are not really spoken to. Like there's not language that says something is expressly allowed or prohibited. It just kind of falls into this gray area and ends up being this loophole. And we have seen some of these emerge with the adult use cannabis legalization. And a particular one that's emerged in many states is this, as an example to illustrate this issue, is the gifting loophole. So in many of the states that legalize adult use possession, there'll be a provision in there that allows adults 21 or over to gift cannabis that they legally have to another adult 21 or over. This predominantly is going to be in states that also allow home grows. But basically, so someone is doing a home grow and they want to provide cannabis to a 21 plus friend or family member who maybe is living in an apartment or is in some situation where they can't grow or get access to it, they can gift their cannabis to that person. The loophole that emerged is that in pretty much all these states, the intention of the policy or the law is for it truly to be a gift. That it's a free transaction. There's no compensation with that transaction. However, particularly in Maine and Massachusetts, when the first iterations of the law were passed, the language was kind of vague or not specific enough to completely rule out our pathways to get compensated for the gifting transaction. So some of the really creative things you would see would be things like charging a packaging fee for the cannabis. So not charging for the cannabis itself, that's still free, but there's a significantly markup fee for the packaging or for a delivery service. Or maybe there's some other product that comes along with it, like a sticker. We've seen some of these. I can't remember what state, I'm pretty sure it's in New England. There's a place that's selling a very marked up sticker to go along with the free cannabis. Actually, it might be in New York or New Jersey, and might not be New England. Anyway, so this is a good example of this loophole. So there wasn't specific language, or not specific enough language in the law that said you couldn't be compensated for something coming along with the cannabis. And so then again, because I'm more familiar with it in Maine, what they did is they passed subsequent legislation to put that more specific language in there that said you couldn't be compensated for any aspect of that transaction. Of course, because the challenge there is you have these sort of ad hoc businesses cropping up, and then like no one's really aware of like who's responsible for them in terms of the regulation. And this is just an example of the language from Connecticut, the Connecticut statute in terms of the gifting provision there. So you can see it as it reads, cannabis gifts allow consumers to give cannabis to other consumers for free within the bill's possession limit. The bill allows consumers, i.e. people aged 21 or over, to give cannabis to other consumers for free, i.e. without compensation or consideration. This applies if the giver reasonably believes that the other person may possess the cannabis without exceeding the bill's possession limit. So here you can see an example of language that's a bit more specific to speak to that compensation piece. Another kind of pro tip, particularly for our prevention public health field, I like to point out is sometimes there can be a disconnect between the implementation law, the legislation that legalizes or sets up the infrastructure for adult use cannabis, and then the rules, which is really that day-to-day regulation and oversight. And so one of the examples is, one thing that we're concerned about, particularly in the public health sphere, is just some of the education that the public has around some of the risks with cannabis, particularly for pregnant women, for risks for addiction, those kind of things. And so a lot of the states, to their credit, will actually put in the implementation law that there's some requirements for packaging and labeling a health and safety warning. Which, when you look at that, again, from a prevention public health perspective, or really any perspective, like requiring that health and safety warning would seem like a good step. But then when you look at the rules, and again, this is an example from Maine. I have a little Easter egg on this slide to illustrate this disconnect. If you look underneath the color bars of the slide, you'll see a line of text in a very small font. And I'll read it for you if you can't read it. It says, can you read this? Maine legalization implementation requires health warnings, but the minimum font is 6 points. Is this effective? So this is a good example, again, of that disconnect that could be between something that looks good on paper in the implementation law, but then in the rules, the execution of that may not be very effective. So you can think of this health and safety warning of that size kind of next to a logo or something. It could be basically hiding in plain sight, and it probably isn't super effective. So I think the point of these two slides is just, as you're paying attention to policy and looking at it, that literacy and kind of looking out for these loopholes and being able to identify these disconnects between implementation law and rules is kind of important to help us kind of anticipate some issues we may need to deal with. The other thing about cannabis policy is, in particular, when we're thinking about, again, the public health risks, the risks to individuals, whether we're talking about addiction, the physical, mental health risks, but particularly with young people and young adults, we know from prevention research there are specific types of risk factors with these kind of commercial industries, whether we're talking about alcohol, tobacco, and now cannabis. And then there's certain provisions in these policies that track or connect with those risk factors. So those being the low perception of risk and harm, retail access, social access, pricing and promotion, policies and enforcement, and then norms that are favorable to youth or young adult substance use. And those norms can both be sort of family norms, but they can also be community norms set by community and institutional policies. So again, when I'm training our prevention field, I kind of identify some of these things in policy that we kind of want to keep an eye on. So we're concerned about retail access and how that may impact risk factors or impact individuals. Things we might want to look at are what are the provisions going to be around buffer zones, the amount of space that's going to be between a licensee and a school or a college or a youth serving organization. Are there going to be any caps on the number of dispensaries that are going to be allowed? What are the hours of operation? We think about things like policies and enforcement, which is a particular risk factor. What are the provisions for and funding for training law enforcement or drug courts or other parts of the justice system? What is even the structure of state regulation can have an impact on whether there's strong policies and whether or not those are enforced. And then, I mentioned the 3 stages, and again, we have a couple of states that are in our sort of that post-implementation phase, namely Maine and Massachusetts, where again, every session, we're seeing this now in Maine, we have a few bills that are in the legislature looking at making some changes to our legalization law. And really, it's even before the ink dries on the, again, whether we're talking about adult use or medical, bills will come forward to make changes. And as with any industry, similar with alcohol and tobacco and even drug industries, we know there's lobbyists that are involved in that, and we'll be constantly looking for and advocating for changes that are going to benefit their industry. And the nature of industries that, like alcohol, tobacco, and now cannabis, and pharmaceuticals, we can think of that as well. We know often that some of these changes are going to rub against things like public health and public safety. And so again, just another reason I think it's important for us, wherever we sit in the behavioral health continuum or of services, to have some at least understanding of what those are looking like and what may be coming down the pike and how it may impact us. And so some of the things that you can see change in the subsequent legislation are things like buffer zones. So a lot of states start with a buffer zone of 1,000 feet. In Maine, we've had bills to attempt to reduce it to 300 or 500. They haven't gone through at this point, but that's one thing that can come forward. If there's any caps on the number of dispensaries that are allowed, either on a state level or even at a local level, those are things that can be changed through state or local policy. The nature of sales, whether things like delivery sales are allowed, vending sales, drive-throughs. The regulation of advertising. I think this is an area where we can expect probably a lot of litigation as different, we've seen in some other states where like certain type of advertising is found to be in violation, and then things go to the courts. Particularly with our First Amendment, it's going to be a challenging area, and I think an ever-evolving area in terms of how advertising is regulated. And the different types of licenses that are in the regime, again, using Maine as an example, when our Citizens Initiative passed in 2016, it originally had a license type that would have allowed the operation of social clubs. Now, when the legislature passed the final legislation, they actually ended up stripping those out. So the social clubs didn't move forward in Maine, but I think we anticipate at some point a bill probably would come forward to try to put those back in. And then I think there's lots of other types of things that can be changed as well. And so thinking about the impact that policy can have on public health and safety, just one example to illustrate this is actually an example from the West Coast in Oregon, where just a couple years ago, they had this huge surplus of cannabis in their state. So at one point, and at the end of 2019, they had enough cannabis that was kind of harvested and cultivated, but wasn't necessarily going out the door to the dispensaries, that it could have made up to 1 billion joints. Or looking at it another way, it was enough that the THC supply per capita for adults in Oregon was a 6.5-year supply at the beginning of 2019. And one of the reasons this happened is that in policy, there was a bit of a disconnect between cultivation and sales in the dispensaries, in that there wasn't really a link between or a check on that the amount of cannabis that was being cultivated or harvested was connected to again the number of sales that were actually going out to the door. Because of that mismatch, there was so much being cultivated that it was just kind of sitting there. And so one of the biggest impacts on that, and you can probably imagine other impacts as well, is a huge change in the price. The price in 3 years, the price of cannabis went from $10 a gram to less than $5 a gram. So the price really dropped in Oregon. And from a public health perspective, we can look at the prevention research and look at examples again from alcohol, tobacco, and others, where we know that price has an impact not just on underage use, but can have an impact also on adult use in terms of overconsumption and unhealthy consumption. So we know price is a factor, and again, an example of how policy has an influence on that. And so, and of course, Oregon was one of those first waves of states that legalized. Subsequent states have tried to make that better connection in policy. And so this is an example of language that where, in states that have cultivation licenses usually come in at a certain tier for a certain square footage of cannabis you're allowed to grow. And then if you want to move, in this example, from tier 2 to tier 3, from 2,000 square feet up to 7,000, you first have to demonstrate that you're selling 85% of your product that you're cultivating. So at least 85% of what you're cultivating is going out the door of the dispensaries. So I've talked a lot about state level policy. There's really two more very important levels of policy when it comes to cannabis, and those are that's the local municipal level and the organizational level. And so at the local level, so state legalization obviously is that first step, and then after that happens, it kind of goes to the local level in terms of what it looks like on the ground in cities and towns. And so there's a lot that communities have to think about in terms of if and how they're going to move forward with retail sales and other licenses. One of the first decisions will be whether or not they opt in or opt out of retail sales. Now, so these are two different. Currently, Vermont and Maine are opt-in states, and then Massachusetts and am I coming through okay? I saw the internet unstable. An array or am I come through? Okay, thank you.
Yep, hearing you just fine.
All right, sorry, good. The internet unstable popped up on my screen, so I wanted to make sure. Yeah, so Maine and Vermont are opt-in states, and then Massachusetts and Connecticut are opt-out states. So basically what that means is an opt-in state at the local level, if they want to allow one or more different types of adult use licenses, there has to be some kind of local ordinance passed, whether it's through Board of Selectmen, Town Council, a townwide vote, however that happens in that municipality or that city, that has to happen before those licenses are going to be allowed to operate in those municipalities. Opt-out is the reverse. So if a particular city or town doesn't want to, for example, have any type of licenses, or maybe they want to have cultivation, but they don't want to have dispensaries, they'll have to opt out of what they don't want in their municipality. So again, whatever that mechanism looks like, they have to go through those steps to opt out. So again, that's one of the big first decisions that municipalities have to look at. And so that's probably, I think that's where Connecticut and Vermont is right now. And actually, even still in Maine and Massachusetts, even though it passed a few years ago, I can again speak more to Maine, but I know we've had, I think, a few dozen at the most towns and cities that have opted in, and a vast majority of our municipalities haven't taken any action at this point. So And then eventually they may decide to opt in or they may not. So then, however, those municipalities make those decisions, whether they opt in or opt out. But if there are going to be some types of licenses that are going to be allowed to operate in the municipality, then this rest of this menu is kind of things that they have to look at. So things such as zoning. So where are they going to go? Are there going to be limits on the number of dispensaries? And so some towns and cities will do that. They'll say we're only going to have 3 in our town or 4, or there may be unlimited numbers, such as that's the case in the city of Portland here in Maine, where there's no cap on the number of dispensaries that are allowed. Will there be any kind of density limits or sort of regulation on how close together dispensaries or our licenses can be? Well, what does local enforcement look like? How is that funded? How is that trained? Those kind of things. Talked about the buffer zones. In states, there may be options for the municipality to initiate a different buffer zone from what's set at the state level. Whether they may be able to opt in for a smaller buffer zone, or maybe, well, probably not a larger one, because in most cases you can't go stricter than the state. Smell and other types of nuisance ordinances, which are very challenging. It's very hard to regulate airflow, but there are certain technologies, smell mitigation technologies that are out there that a town municipality could require as a part of local, as a piece of local licensing. Parcel limits for home grows. So in Maine and Massachusetts, in Maine, adults are allowed to have up to 3 mature plants at home, and then an unlimited number of seedlings, and then in Massachusetts at 6. So if you had 5 adults on a piece of property, in theory, if you do the math, you could have 15, or wait, no, 5 times 5 is 25. No, 5 times 6 is 30, so a parcel limit might be, a municipality says, we're going to set a limit of 12. Like no matter how many adults you have on this piece of property, you can't have more than 12 mature plants on this property. So that's something that could happen at a local level if the state law allows it, of course. And then local level funding for services, whether we're talking about prevention and education, other types of behavioral health or social services, and if there's local fees that are coming in, and we can identify and anticipate certain impacts on the community, whether we're talking about addiction issues, mental health, or whatever, enforcement issues, can some of that money, pay for the services that would mitigate or prevent those issues? And then the organizational level. So this is, if you're familiar with it, my prevention friends who are on this training will be familiar with this model, the social ecological model. So we know there's these different spheres of influence around individuals. There's their own individual level of risk and protective factors, but then there are those from family networks, the overarching state and societal or societal and public policy sphere, but then the green and the blue, so that community level norms, and then the organizational. So the organizations and the institutions in our community actually have a very powerful role in influencing, how this impacts individuals, young people, young adults across the lifespan by how they approach this and through their own policies in their organizations and institutions. And so you can think of some of the types of organizations and institutions. Certainly drug courts are going to be on that list, but others in our communities that have to think about, if their state is legalized, if their municipality is going to be opting into sales, or different types of licenses, institutions such as housing, education, both K through 12, colleges and universities, employers, healthcare settings, transportation, and there's probably many more that you could think of. How they proceed with this can have literally, influence on the folks in our communities. And so when I do these talks for our prevention and public health field, I actually go a little bit more in depth in terms of how can we support these organizations and institutions and thinking about how to develop smart policies that take the public health prevention, science into consideration, but also consider like how can they make a policy effective through identifying measures and metrics to monitor it, how to train on it, how to communicate those policies. So that's something in some other trainings I go a little bit more in depth into. So that's something anyone is interested in, would love to have that more in depth kind of training. Definitely let us know. We can help out with that. All right, so this is where I'm going to take my first pause. I do see some questions in the Q&A.
Yes, we have quite a few there, Scott. So how about I start to put them out to you?
Yeah, if you want to, yeah, that would be great.
Absolutely. So John is asking, he said, I would love to hear Scott's take on those folks who are substance use affected and are in recovery using medical marijuana. So that issue that many of us get working in this field of, hey, I was, a doc prescribed me this, et cetera, et cetera. What is your thoughts on this?
That's a really great question, and I'm not ducking the question, but I'm going to answer it partly. But one of my last sections, when I get into the lower risk guidelines, hopefully will help with this very question, because one of the challenges is with medical cannabis, particularly if someone's using it for a certain type of condition, is it is a law, it is a policy, it is legalized in our states, but then we have to think about it from a scientific perspective. And as I always say, medical cannabis, and I'm not trying to get political here, but the reality is medical cannabis is a political creation, not a scientific one, because literally that is how it's come to play. So there's the law, but then we're talking about how it's impacting individuals, whether they're individual risk factors, whether we're worried about dependence or other kind of health impacts. I think that's where we have the opportunity to try to do education and one-on-one support to try to go at it from that framing. Like, yes, it may be legal, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's healthy, or may not be healthy for you. And that's obviously as sort of what their individual factors are going to come into play. The things I get concerned about with medical cannabis is, again, there's a lot of conditions that end up on these lists in states that don't necessarily have a lot of rigorous science backing them up. And so I think, again, it may be legal, but if we have an opportunity to consult or educate individuals on whether or not it might be the right thing for them in their situation, where we have those opportunities to do that. So I know that's a very weaselly, not straightforward answer, but it is a challenge because it's legal. But again, if I put my science hat on, the science isn't particularly robust, again, from a treatment perspective of treating any kind of condition. There is some modest evidence for certain pain treatments. There's some modest evidence for like nausea and vomiting associated with cancer treatment. The list, but we're talking on the level of substantial levels of evidence. The list is fairly small in terms of the effectiveness of it. So I don't know if that was helpful or not. I feel like I gave a weaselly political kind of answer, but it is challenging. I will admit that. But hopefully when I get into the risk factors section, that will provide some information that will be helpful as well, because I think there are some clear themes emerging from the science of where we can hopefully have some inroads with people, at least from a harm reduction perspective. If abstinence or not using is not on the table, are there ways we can coach people to lowering their risks from their cannabis use if it's, they're at kind of a risky level?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we do have a already tried and true, to some extent, framework as it relates to alcohol, right? That's a legal substance, but it's not necessarily helpful, if you will, in recovery. So thank
Right.
you. I look forward to the rest of that as we flesh that out later on. We have a good question here about during this training, and maybe this isn't the time that you want to talk about it, but I'll let you make that decision. Could you talk a little bit about cannabis and pregnancy?
Yes. I don't have any slides in this presentation. Actually, there is. We partnered with the Central East PTTC, which covers the Mid-Atlantic region, on a really good webinar that had a couple of experts that talked about it. And so the short answer is there are identified risks in the research around pregnancy, things like for the child, things like low birth weight. There's some breastfeeding issues, brain development, particular issues, but also obviously for the woman herself during pregnancy, there's some risks as well. So for time, I won't get into depth on that, but what I will do is make sure I provide Ray and you with links to that recording of that webinar. It's a free webinar. You can, but also, and I do have at the end of the slide some resources, and SAMHSA has a really great evidence-based resource guide for cannabis use and pregnancy, which kind of lays out the science and some of those risk factors, but also some good prevention initiatives and intervention initiatives to address that.
Oh, terrific.
So I have that at the end of the slide deck, but I will also make sure I send along the link to that recording, because it was a really great webinar with a couple of really great experts who actually helped write that resource guide I talked about.
Oh, wonderful. Great. Okay. Thank you. We have a question from an individual who's asking for you to talk about the difference between cannabis use disorder versus cannabis recreational use. And then I know this is might have kind of gone in line with that first question, but this anonymous is saying that they have many clients with medical cards who are diagnosed with cannabis use disorder. And so she just wants some clarification around that area.
Well, again, this isn't one, like, if we're thinking clinically cannabis use disorder, I mean, I think that's basically, you know, I think whether it's medical or adult use, I don't think it, because I mean, the reality is that the substances themselves, like the products that are sold, whether we're talking about an adult use market or a medical market, honestly, are not substantially different. And often there's not a substantial difference in how, in terms of the content of the products, how it's regulated. So you can develop a cannabis use disorder, whichever whichever market you're using, the adult use market or the medical market. So it's really all about meeting those DSM criteria. So I'd say if whether someone's using it for adult use purposes or medical purposes, they're both, because again, a product can be sold in both. And often in a lot of states there are a lot of states that actually mingle. Like you go into one store, one dispensary, they're selling both adult use products and medical cannabis products. The only difference is some are in a different case. But if you took two products and put them side by side, like the composition of them are not dramatically different. Because again, there's nothing in the state regulations that says a medical cannabis product has to have this content, this THC content, this CBD content. You could literally have the same product sold in both markets.
Right. Okay. Are there different parameters or certifications required for cannabis growers in Maine or any of the other New England states?
I think they're not necessarily around certification, but there may be different requirements around, I'm sure there are different requirements in terms of backgrounds. The obvious example is like criminal backgrounds. There are certain types of criminal offenses that are going to rule folks out or not to be able to operate a license. So I think that probably varies. And unfortunately, I can't speak to it off the top of my head, but so there are probably some different stipulations, slightly different stipulations from state to state as to who can operate a license. I will say, though, those aren't always necessarily enforced. I mean, again, the example I can provide for Maine is on paper, we have a residential requirement for licenses where you have to be a Maine resident for 4 years to be able to operate a license, but our Office of Marijuana Policies basically said they're not going to enforce that. So it is a law on the books, but it's not being enforced, or it's not going to be enforced. So it's in litigation right now, but so I probably should move on for the rest of my content. A lot of great questions, and I want to make sure I get this all in the amount of time. So thank you, great, for all those great questions. I'll try to get to more at the end. All right, so next I have some excerpts from our cannabis pharmacology course, and hopefully some of this is new information. It's not too much review, but just to kind of lay out sort of, again, the latest understandings we have around cannabis and health impacts. This is a very small portion of a 3-module, 4.5-hour course That's a free course through the PTTC network. But so short-term effects that we know, right? So there's physical, mental, novel effects, memory and learning, impacts on time and unintentional overdose. So we talk about physical effects, things like relaxation, pain control. So again, there is some modest evidence that some of the cannabinoids in isolation that are actually isolated can have some benefits around pain control. Bloodshot eyes, lung irritation, increased appetite, impaired driving, some of those things that can impair driving, such as eye tracking and trailing phenomena. So we do have good evidence that makes that association. Some of the mental, short-term mental effects, right? Separation from the environment, feelings of drowsiness and aloofness, increased alertness, but distorted time, color or sound, exaggerated mood, impacts on memory and learning. And this, of course, is particularly profound in during adolescence and young adulthood. And as we know, current thinking is that brain development is going into our mid-20s. So even for young adults, this can still potentially have an impact, particularly if there's heavy use of potent THC products. Unintentional overdose. So this is particularly acute in children and adolescents who aren't intending to consume a cannabis product. As I'm sure most everyone is familiar with, the edible products that are in all of the markets. So there are a lot of candies and other edible products that look almost identical to a non-THC comparable product. And then once you take them out of packaging, they don't look any different. So that's where a lot of these unintentional overdoses are happening, particularly with children. And then with adults, the unintentional overdoses tends to be from overconsumption. Again, and particularly with the edibles, because not everyone understands the delayed effect of edibles. And so they'll consume a part of it, nothing happens, and then they consume the whole thing. And then all that THC hits the system, and then they have that overdose. And then we think about the current understanding around long-term effects, respiratory complications. So we have good evidence that there are impacts on the lungs and the respiratory system. We don't at this point have that sort of causal link like we have with tobacco smoke and lung cancer. I will note, though, that the state of California actually categorizes cannabis smoke as a carcinogen. Again, not because of a established causal link in the research, but because there's a lot of components in cannabis smoke that have been found to be carcinogenic. So we do know that those impacts. Particularly when we're in this era of COVID, I think that's an important piece, is that it can compromise the lungs, particularly obviously smoking and vaping THC products. And so if someone has had COVID or a recent bout of that, a lot of smoking of cannabis probably not going to help in terms of their recovery. And then if you've heard of this, the cyclical vomiting syndrome or cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, which again is often associated with this overdose of THC in the system. And it's basically the body violently trying to get rid of the THC through some very unpleasant symptoms. And so this is an increasing issue that we're seeing in people, particularly again, who are regular heavy users of potent THC products. We see some impact on the immune system from a long-term use, and then acute mental effects. And this is where we get into, I think, some of the challenging area again with medical cannabis, where often there's advocacy around trying to add more mental health conditions to medical cannabis laws. I know a lot of the states have PTSD as one of the conditions that are allowed for mental health. And unfortunately, we have a lot of science that really points to that there's actually can be some risks, again, from heavy, prolonged THC use and some mental health outcomes, such as anxiety, paranoia, mood disorders, suicidal ideations. We're seeing more and more associations between prolonged heavy use of cannabis and suicide, confusion and brain fog, memory lapses. So this is where I do get concerned with the medical cannabis side of things, and I think a place where we need to do more education and awareness again that again it may be legal, but then what does the science say in terms of whether this is a good thing for you to use, given where you are with different risk factors. And then of course dependence. And then what's notable here is when you look at some of the withdrawal symptoms that we're seeing in the research, again with people who are long-term users of THC products, and then stopping that or backing off of that. When you look at some of these withdrawal symptoms, anxiety, depression, inability to concentrate, like those track with some of the things that we hear from either the industry or advocates on the medical cannabis side of reasons to legalize medical cannabis to treat those things. And so it becomes a bit of a chicken and the egg thing, where if someone is saying that, oh yeah, my depression is a lot better when I'm using cannabis, when I'm smoking. So the question we have to ask is that depression that existed before cannabis use or not? Because it may be that they're not treating. There may be that they're treating withdrawal symptom, basically. So that's an important piece for us to understand, and as we're dealing and working with individuals, is sort of understanding, like, where did this condition start? If the depression or the anxiety didn't really start or didn't really become serious until after they started using cannabis, maybe the issue is with withdrawal symptoms and not, a pre-existing mental health condition. And then for the next few slides, if you've not seen this this research, there's this great report that came out from the National Academies of Science in 2017 that did really rigorous looking at meta-analysis of a lot of research in cannabis to come to some conclusions on different outcomes, both in terms of physical health, mental health, addiction, and some other areas. And so I'm just, in these next few slides, these are just a few of the findings. It's not an all exhaustive list. And on each of these slides, I'll have what the level of evidence is for it. So for example, for this first one, this is from a conclusive level of evidence, which basically means that there are many supportive findings from quality studies and really no credible opposing findings in any research. So it's like as close as you can get to an ironclad finding in science as you can get, which is, of course, as we know in science, you don't ever 100% get to an ironclad finding, but it's as close as you can get. And this is one of the places where there is some moderate evidence in terms of some potential helpful treatment from cannabinoids, which is around nausea and vomiting from chemotherapy and related to cancer treatment. Now, this is primarily related to an oral treatment, which is actually an FDA-approved medicine called Marinol, which is actually synthetic THC. So that's where this finding comes from. And again, that's a FDA-approved medicine. That's the THC isolated from whole plant cannabis versus a product that you're going to get in a cannabis dispensary, which is not isolated. It's from whole plant cannabis, which means there's probably other cannabinoids and other chemicals from the plant that are still present, which we don't necessarily completely understand. So substantial evidence. So this is like a sort of a little bit more of a rung down, where there's still lots of good quality studies with very few or limited studies with opposing findings, but it's still firm enough that we can kind of go with it. So some of these include things such as one particular risk factor, or a couple risk factors when it comes to developing a problem cannabis use, is being male and smoking cigarettes. So if you're working with individuals who are male or smoking cigarettes, and there's concerns about cannabis dependence from their cannabis use, that could be a potential red flag or something to be aware of, is that they're just, from the research and from the data, these are two categories of folks who seem to be at increased risk of developing problematic cannabis use. We do see, and this speaks to one of the earlier questions, the statistical association between maternal cannabis smoking and lower birth weight offspring. Substantial evidence of a statistical association between cannabis use and increased risk of motor vehicle crashes. Because unfortunately, this is another, I think, we're all called myth that still pervades, that there is no risk of impairment, of motor vehicle impairment from using cannabis, in an area of work that we're all going to have to be engaged in for a while to get more understanding from the public broadly, but then folks who are using cannabis that know that there are definitely risks of impairment, and it can lead to motor vehicle crashes. Moderate evidence, so again, another rung down. So there are several supportive findings from good to fair quality studies with few or no credible opposing findings. So a general conclusion can be made, but there are some limitations and potentially some chance or bias. So still, I think good to guide us in terms of looking at red flags, but being open to potentially more developments down the road as the science continues. So when we look at, again, risk factors for developing cannabis use disorders at a moderate level of evidence, some of those risk factors tend to be look to be things such as the frequency of cannabis use, oppositional behaviors, younger age of first alcohol use. So young people who use alcohol at a very early age are at increased risk of cannabis use disorder, nicotine use, parental substance use, poor school performance, antisocial behaviors, and then childhood sexual abuse. So a moderate level of evidence that these are all risk factors for developing a cannabis use disorder. We see statistical association between the persistence of problem cannabis use and a history of psychiatric treatment. Statistical association between problem cannabis use and increased severity of PTSD symptoms. And that gets back to, again, it's my commentary, one of my concerns seeing PTSD on some of the medical cannabis condition lists is this reason here, is that there's enough science that seems to point to that might not be a good recommendation. So again, it may be in the law, but as we're dealing with individuals, it may still be a point of education that, hey, there is some science that points to that maybe this is not a good thing for you based on your individual scenario. And then statistical association between cannabis use and increased risk of overdose injuries, including respiratory distress in pediatric populations in U.S. states where cannabis is legal. And I'm sure a lot of folks on this webinar are probably familiar with the ongoing conversation, debate about whether or not legalized cannabis has any impact on the opioid crisis one way or the other. You'll hear some folks will say it will help reduce the opioid crisis issue. Others that it won't. And but I mean, this is a good example. And there's other. I mean, I just saw a working paper recently that's looking at potentially it does increase some risks of opioid overdose deaths. So there's definitely, I don't think it's certainly not settled science one way or the other at this point, but something we have to definitely keep our eye on in terms of how that may or may not shape opioid use disorders and overdoses. And then moderate statistical association between cannabis use and the development of substance dependence and or substance abuse disorder for substances including alcohol, tobacco, and other illicit drugs. So this gets into what in the past is referred to as the gateway theory, which is a term, I just uttered it, but one I tend to avoid myself because there is a lot of baggage that comes along with just that term, kind of like with reefer madness, if you will. But I do think there is, again, there is science out there that definitely shows that, particularly with younger people, when they start any substance at a younger age, whether it's alcohol, tobacco, or cannabis, it does increase risk for later substance use disorder, which can include, substances like heroin, opioids, and other substances. But it's really about how the brain works. It isn't necessarily about any individual substance. It's just the fact that introducing a substance while the brain is still developing can potentially prime the brain to be predisposed to want more of that behavior and activity. So it's really as simple as that. It's not just marijuana, it's not just alcohol, it's like any substance at a young age is going to increase that risk. So again, that was a very small excerpt from this larger course. If you want more of that, we could benefit from more in-depth information on cannabis pharmacology. Again, we have this 3-module course. It's 4.5 hours. You go to healthyknowledge.org. You can get a free account there, and all the courses are free, so you can take that there. So there's 3 individual courses, and there's some content questions at the end. You can test your knowledge. So definitely encourage you to check that out. Are there any? I have one last section, but if there's a particular question you think I should answer from that last section.
Okay, so one of the things that I'm looking here real quickly, there was a few things here. Michaela is asking, I do have to ask why you ask about what the science recommends and mentioned concerns about side effects. In many cases, medical doctors are prescribing medical marijuana, and many psych meds have side effects similar to the ones mentioned. What are your thoughts about this?
So are we talking about cope? I'm not sure if I understand the question. Is it about prescribing both?
Yeah, she was talking about how there's many cases medical docs are prescribing both medical marijuana and psych meds that also sometimes will have similar effects. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there is some, and I don't go into depth here, but there is emerging, there's emerging science looking at the confluence of cannabis, whether it's medical, adult use, whatever, with other substances, including prescribed. So, I mean, there's not a lot of robust specific that I'm aware of with psychiatric medicines, but just broadly, I mean, so I think that's one of the messages is there's a lot of unknowns,
right,
in terms of if and how they interact. But there's definitely with other substances like alcohol and even opioids or other substances that potentially the effects can be compounded. I mean, that's definitely the case with cannabis and alcohol, that the emerging science is pointing towards co-use really amplifying sort of the side effects. So yeah, I'm not super, and if anyone else on this on the webinar has good resources, definitely put that in the chat and share those. So I'm not very super specific information on that, but just broadly, certainly concerns about how those may interact. Definitely an area where we need to learn more.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So I have a question here in the Q&A that I've been monitoring the chat, and several other people have kind of mentioned it. So I'm going to hopefully get a bunch of people's questions answered. And through one question, you talked about earlier, and I got a lot of wows on medical marijuana is a political creation, not a medical one. Do you want to expand on that just a little bit, because that seemed to generate some lively discussion in the chat feature?
Yeah, and again, I don't say that to be controversial. It's
sure.
It's but technically it's correct. Like, because it didn't, because I mean it was either it's passed as a law in a legislature or through a citizens initiative, as it was in Maine. And what I mean by that, and I think why that's important, is that the general public, because I've heard this because I do presentations for a lot of different audiences that sometimes include sort of broader public, and there is a thought or understanding by some in the public that medical cannabis was created by researchers, by doctors, by such as like in the same way that medicated assisted treatment was developed, like through research. But while proponents may bring forward some evidence to support that, at the end of the day, medical cannabis as a policy exists because there was some kind of policy that was passed to allow it. And that's why I mean, again, I'll give the example of PTSD. If in my, this is just my opinion, looking at the research as I've seen it, if we were to base it, if it was purely a scientific creation, we probably wouldn't have PTSD on the list of conditions. At a minimum, there's enough questions. We probably shouldn't have it as a recommendation, as a treatment, because we don't have, again, in my estimation, we don't have rigorous science that backs it up as an evidence-based treatment for PTSD. Maybe with more research, we will get there, and it will be. But at this point, based on what I've seen, we can't say that. So that's why I make that distinction. It's more for, I think, the individuals in the public, because I think they do have what I would call a misunderstanding that because it's legal, that it went through a rigorous scientific process to become legal, which isn't necessarily the case. So again, I don't mean to be controversial with that, but I just think it's important for the public to have that understanding, because there is, I think, sometimes that understanding that this was developed by scientists, but it really wasn't. So I hope that, and I again, I don't mean to be controversial, but for me, I think it's important for the public to understand. Same thing with the difference between medical cannabis and adult use cannabis. Reality is those two products can be identical. You got this identical product sold in either market. It's literally the same product, with just a different label and a different package. And but the public think there's actually scientific differences between medical cannabis and adult use cannabis, like in terms of the content and the makeup of it. And the reality is that there isn't. So.
Terrific. Okay, did you say you have another section to complete?
Yes, I want to get through this last section.
Jump in there. And I think we've done this in the past. If this works for you, Scott, is we've taken the outstanding questions, and if you were able to maybe answer them offline, and then we can put them out to the participants when we send the evaluation link, if that's possible.
Yeah, definitely.
So nobody worry that if your question doesn't get answered right in this moment, Scott will be able to address it and we'll send it out. So with that, I'll let you jump to where you want to go.
Yeah, I will. And anything I can't answer, I'll send to Ray to find someone to answer.
Oh, yeah, great idea. I love it. Thank you.
All right. So this last section is so this is a study that came out, or a paper that came out a few months ago, and I love it because often you get a journal article, it's really dense, and there's useful information in there, and you read the conclusion, and it's like, I still don't know, and a lot of this is I don't understand. It's really jargony, but what I love about this is it's the way that it's structured. It's really easy to understand, but I also think it's very important. So again, this is kind of like that those last few slides where this paper is a synthesis of multiple research and studies to come to some conclusions, or conclusions is not the right word, but to some recommendations on how, so people who are using cannabis for whatever reason, medical, adult use, whatever, what are some guidelines for how they could lower their risks? Whether we're talking about physical health, mental health, addiction, whatever the risks are, what are some understandings we can glean from the state of the research such that it is, that we can provide these guidelines on how individuals can lower their risk. So these next few slides, I pulled out some of these recommendations. It's not all of them. This link here is live, so when you get the PDF, when you click on this, you'll be able to go to it. And this is a free journal article. You don't need to pay anything to get it. So definitely strongly encourage you to check it out, because it's easy to read. I mean, journal articles are hard for me to dive through, and I could understand this. So this is really good. Wait, what am I doing? No, I didn't want to do that. Okay. So there are you'll see when you see the study, there's 3 precautions that are in here along with the recommendations. So general precaution A, and again, this has those same levels of evidence we saw on the previous slide. So this is at a conclusive level of evidence, which is you can go to the bank on this one. And this probably seems obvious, but this general precaution is that people who use cannabis need to know that there is no universally safe level of cannabis use. The only reliable way to avoid any risk for harm from using cannabis is to not use. So what this means, though, what this doesn't say is that anyone, like every use of cannabis is going to lead to some harm or a negative outcome. It's not saying that. What it's saying is kind of the inverse. Is we can't say that any level of cannabis use is 100% risk-free. So that's what this is saying. Is we can't say, it's not like in the old days of alcohol, right, where we had the standard drink and those kind of like recommendations on how often you can drink a week or whatever and be at a safe level of consumption. And this is basically saying we can't come up with that for cannabis at this point. And not saying that we ever will, but that, you know, the state of the evidence is we can't say that there's any level of cannabis use that is 100% risk-free. Again, that's not saying every use of cannabis is going to lead to something bad and horrible, but just people need to understand it's not a 100% risk-free behavior. So recommendation number 1, the initiation of cannabis use should be delayed until after late adolescence or the completion of puberty to reduce development-related vulnerabilities of harm. And this is not anything new. We would have the same recommendation for alcohol, tobacco, any other substances. Basically, the more we delay onset of use, the better off people will be, and especially when it comes to things like dependence and addiction. Like that's what in prevention, that's one of our common drumbeats is delay, delay, delay. Like not use at all is certainly a gold standard in a lot of ways, but delaying is definitely one of our strategies. Recommendation number 2 is people who use cannabis should use low potency, that's in quotation marks, that's not defined necessarily, cannabis products, i.e. products with ideally lower total THC content or high CBD THC content ratio. So quickly, if folks are not familiar, one of the things that CBD does in cannabis products is it does act as somewhat of a regulator or moderator of the effects of THC. So the more CBD you have, the more it sort of moderates the psychoactive effect of THC, the less CBD you have. So if you had like a super high THC product and with super low amount of CBD versus a product that had the same THC content but higher CBD, like those impacts will be different because it acts a little bit of a moderator. But anyway, so the potency, so there's substantial to moderate evidence that potency is associated with risks of acute and chronic adverse mental and physical health outcomes. So that is an important recommendation there as well. And so low potency is in kind of in quotation marks. So we can't really define what that is. Folks I talk to suggest maybe it's 10% or lower. Anything 10%. So again, there's not a consensus on that at this point, but there seems to be emerging revolution around the concept of 10% or higher is high level or is potent, or less than 10% is low potency. The challenge is good luck finding something 10% or lower in the adult use or medical markets. That's the challenge. Recommendation number 3, all forms of cannabis consumption come with some risk of harm. People who use cannabis should refrain from smoking and employ alternative routes of use for pulmonary health protection. So that's the point of this recommendation, is that not that there's any safe route of administration for THC or cannabis, but for folks to understand that smoking has increased risk for the pulmonary system. Recommendation number 5, so this gets into frequency of use. So people who use cannabis should refrain from frequent or intensive, so like daily use and binge using, and limit themselves to less frequent use. So there's substantial evidence that this is a risk factor, again, for mental health and physical health. So again, so this is one area where we could work with someone to lower the risks, their individual risks if they're using daily or if they're using very intensely when they're using. Is there ways to kind of lessen some of those to lessen the risks? Recommendation number 8, we kind of already covered this already, which is that there is substantial to moderate evidence to link cannabis use to impairment, so it can impair the operation of motor vehicles and heavy machinery. Recommendation number 10, so this does get actually to the previous question to some degree too. People who use cannabis should exercise general caution in combining other psychoactive substances. So moderate to limited evidence, so there's still some more we need to learn about this. But the concurrent use of cannabis and other psychoactive or psychotropic substances can amplify risks of some health harms of each substance. We're tending to understand more of that around alcohol than other substances, but hopefully more research will come out. So then it's just 2 more general precautions. So this is at a substantial level. That's just frequent cannabis use, and especially intensive use over longer periods, can lead to cannabis use disorder or cannabis dependence that may require treatment. So substantial level of evidence there. And general precaution C is that people who use cannabis should exercise social consideration and responsibility in avoiding cannabis use that may result in harm to others. So this is a little bit of a catch-all. So there's a few things rolled into this. So, like alcohol and tobacco, cannabis use can cause harm to others, including, obviously impaired driving, harmful consequences of impaired driving, secondhand smoke exposure, and some cannabis. And some of these harms can have outsized impact on vulnerable and at-risk populations. So to kind of summarize all this, so again, there's no conclusive evidence that there's risk-free level of cannabis use. Moderate evidence that early initiation of use is linked to risks, physical and mental health, and addiction. Substantial evidence that less frequent, less intense use of cannabis use reduces risks. Substantial evidence linking to impaired driving and heavy machinery, and then harm to others. And then I would also throw in, I should have included the issue of potency. So I think in terms of where do we go from here, I think there's like short-term and long-term considerations. I think, the short term, there's going to be a lot of shaping that's going to happen at a local, organizational, institutional policy level. I think addressing potency is a theme for us to think about in the short term, again, particularly vulnerable at-risk populations, whether we're talking about physical health, mental health, addiction, and then delaying onset of use. So I think these are things, as whatever our role is in the behavioral health continuum, I think these are things we can lean into to hopefully mitigate and prevent, major negative outcomes for individuals. Long term.
I was going to say, Scott, and also, sorry to interrupt you. I know we only have a few more minutes. I apologize.
Yeah.
You're really giving us a great jumping off point if we want to continue this series into some other stuff. So that's really appreciated. So I'll give you the next minute or two to wrap up where we are with this. Much appreciated.
Sure. Yeah. And then just the last long term, I think that ongoing education and that for parents, decision makers, levers of influence, which is a catch-all for anyone has influence on the individuals we're serving, young people, people who are at risk, just to that long game of what we needed to do around things like drinking and driving, where the societal change we saw, our understanding around tobacco and those impacts. I think sort of that long game of constant education, so folks understand that this isn't risk-free. There are risks for certain populations, and that should influence how we move forward, not just in terms of policy, but how we fund services and help our communities. So with that, again, you'll have the resources in the slides, but I'm just going to jump to my contact info there. So I know there's a lot of questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to them, but send them my way, and I'm happy to take it, have a go at them.
Absolutely. And also, as I'm reading through the chat, and you might be able to see it, I know you're managing your presentation right now. Many people are clamoring for a part 2 from you. So maybe that's another discussion we'll have and see where you want to take this. This is some terrific information, and it touches so many different areas of the work that we're doing, whether it's public policy, for which you have that that particular expertise in, as well as our prevention folks that are here today, our recovery folks, our treatment folks. So there's been a lot of valuable information, and you've also cleared up so many different things that may be kind of confusing at times for people, especially when in the areas of the different states. I mean, this while NEARCP is a regional organization, obviously we have people from around the country on this presentation, and every state is doing something a little bit differently, as you highlighted so well. So this looks like it needs to be a continuing conversation. I've put in the chat for people to please remember to fill out that evaluation when we send it out to you in the next 24 to 48 hours. There's also some information in there about our upcoming symposium, which we will be partnering with various individuals, some really dynamic speakers who really look at this national symposium on cannabis as well. But please head over to our website to continue this conversation on the forum. That would be phenomenal because people can connect through there and also have different information that they may want to share with one another. So that will be pretty pretty wonderful. I'd like to thank Scott for being here today. This has been, I am just like overwhelmed by this response that we have. And I am so, just so grateful for your expertise and the time and attention that you brought to this community today. And I'm hoping we can steal you again for another episode, if you will. We'll call it season 2.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Thank you all. And we will get out those answers to those questions in a, you know, in a near future, in the very, very near future here. So we'll give Scott some time to look at those things. A lot of questions there. Thank you all very, very much.